The morning sun cast long shadows across the crumbling main street of Millbrook, a town that had been forgotten by maps and time alike. Jake Morrison pressed his back against the weathered brick wall of what used to be Henderson's hardware store, his breath coming in controlled bursts as he listened for any sign of movement beyond the broken storefront windows. 3 days had passed since their convoy broke down on the outskirts of this ghost town, and what had started as a simple overnight stop had become a deadly game of survival against an enemy that grew stronger with each passing hour. Emma Rodriguez crouched beside him, her medical bag clutched tightly in her hands, the contents of which had become more precious than gold in their current situation. She had joined their group only a week ago when they'd rescued her from an overrun hospital in Phoenix, and her knowledge of treating bite wounds without proper equipment had already saved 2 lives. Her dark eyes scanned the abandoned street, noting every shadow that could conceal danger, every doorway that might offer escape. The silence that had once seemed peaceful now felt oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of shuffling feet that seemed to echo from every direction. Marcus Thompson stood guard at the rear entrance of the store, his weathered hands gripping a modified crowbar that had become his signature weapon. The former construction foreman had an uncanny ability to read the structural integrity of buildings, a skill that had guided them to this particular refuge when the zombies had first appeared on Millbrook's horizon. He'd reinforced their position using materials scavenged from the store, creating barriers that could slow down the undead without trapping the living. His gray beard was streaked with dust and sweat, but his eyes remained sharp and focused on the task of keeping his companions alive. The group had learned harsh lessons about the creatures that now roamed Millbrook streets. Unlike the slow, shambling monsters from old movies, these zombies displayed an unsettling intelligence. They hunted in coordinated groups, used simple tools, and seemed to learn from their failures. Rebecca Williams, a former park ranger whom everyone called Becca, had been the first to notice their behavioral patterns. She'd observed them testing the defenses of abandoned buildings, probing for weaknesses with the patience of predators who understood that time was on their side. Tyler Brooks, barely 19 and fresh out of community college, had become their unofficial scout due to his ability to move silently through the debris-strewn streets. His youth worked in his favor, allowing him to squeeze through spaces that would trap the adults, but it also made him reckless in ways that kept the others constantly worried. He discovered that the zombies were drawn to specific sounds, particularly the electrical hum of still-functioning equipment, which explained why they seemed to converge on certain buildings while ignoring others completely. Madison Kelly, a software engineer whose logical mind had adapted remarkably well to their chaotic reality, had been documenting the zombie behavior patterns in a notebook she'd found in the store's office. Her observations revealed that the creatures followed predictable schedules, with their activity levels fluctuating based on environmental factors that the group was still trying to understand. She'd noticed that they became more aggressive during certain times of day and seemed to respond to changes in barometric pressure, suggesting that whatever had created them had also enhanced their sensory capabilities beyond normal human limitations. Ryan Carter, a mechanic whose practical skills had kept their vehicles running until the final breakdown, now focused his talents on creating improvised weapons and fortifications. He'd rigged a series of early warning systems using salvaged car parts and store merchandise, creating a network of noisemakers that would alert them to approaching threats. His knowledge of electronics had also allowed him to modify their remaining radio equipment, enabling them to monitor emergency broadcasts from other survivor groups scattered across the region. Ashley Parker, a former teacher whose calm demeanor masked a steel-strong determination, had taken charge of rationing their limited supplies and planning their daily survival routines. She understood that in their situation, panic was as deadly as any zombie, and her ability to maintain group morale had prevented the kind of internal conflicts that had destroyed other survivor communities. Her background in crisis management had taught her that clear communication and defined roles were essential for keeping people focused on solutions rather than problems. The zombies had appeared in Millbrook gradually, starting with just a few stragglers that the group had easily avoided. But as word of their presence spread through whatever network connected these creatures, more had arrived each day. What had started as a manageable threat had evolved into a siege, with the undead population now outnumbering the living by at least 20 to 1. The creatures had taken up residence in the buildings surrounding their refuge, turning the abandoned town into a maze of potential ambush points and death traps. Jake checked his watch and realized that their current position, while defensible, was becoming untenable. Their food supplies would last maybe 2 more days, and their ammunition was running dangerously low. The zombies seemed content to wait them out, displaying a patience that suggested they understood the humans' predicament better than anyone was comfortable admitting. The time had come to implement the desperate plan they'd been discussing, a strategy that would either lead them to safety or result in their destruction. The real test of their survival skills was about to begin. The plan Jake had conceived during the long, sleepless nights was audacious in its simplicity, yet terrifying in its execution. They would use the zombies' enhanced senses against them by creating a series of distractions that would draw the creatures away from their current location, allowing the group to move through the town's underground utility tunnels that Marcus had discovered during his exploration of the building's basement. The tunnel system connected several buildings throughout Millbrook's commercial district, remnants of a 1940s infrastructure project that had been abandoned when the town's population began its steady decline. Emma had spent the previous evening preparing medical supplies for what she knew would be a dangerous journey through confined spaces where a single mistake could prove fatal. She'd distributed small emergency kits to each team member, containing basic wound care materials and a single dose of powerful antibiotics that she'd been saving for critical situations. Her medical training told her that infections were often more deadly than initial injuries in survival scenarios, and the underground tunnels presented numerous opportunities for cuts and scrapes that could become septic without proper treatment. The first phase of their escape required Tyler to venture outside their fortified position and plant noise-making devices at strategic locations throughout the town. Using materials Ryan had scavenged from abandoned cars, they'd created timing mechanisms that would activate at predetermined intervals, drawing the zombies away from their building in waves. Tyler moved through the pre-dawn darkness with the practiced silence of someone who had learned that a single misstep could alert creatures whose hearing had been enhanced far beyond human capabilities. Marcus had reinforced the basement entrance with materials that could be quickly dismantled from the inside but would appear solid to any pursuing zombies. His construction experience had taught him that the key to effective fortification wasn't just keeping enemies out, but ensuring that defenders could escape when their position became compromised. The tunnel entrance had been concealed behind a false wall made from store merchandise, creating the illusion that the basement ended at the building's foundation. Becca's knowledge of wildlife behavior had proven invaluable in predicting how the zombies would respond to their distraction tactics. She'd observed that the creatures exhibited pack hunting behaviors similar to wolves, with dominant individuals leading groups of followers toward perceived threats or opportunities. By timing their diversions to exploit these behavioral patterns, they could create corridors of relative safety through areas that would normally be impossible to traverse. Madison had calculated the timing sequences for their escape with mathematical precision, factoring in the zombies' movement speeds, their response times to auditory stimuli, and the estimated duration of each distraction. Her software engineering background had trained her to think in terms of algorithms and predictable outcomes, skills that translated surprisingly well to survival planning. She'd identified 3 potential routes through the tunnel system, each with different risk profiles and exit points that could adapt to changing circumstances. The underground passages that would serve as their escape route were cramped, partially flooded, and filled with decades of accumulated debris. Ryan had spent hours clearing the most essential sections, but much of their journey would require crawling through spaces barely wide enough for a single person. The tunnels had no lighting, forcing them to rely on small flashlights that would need to be used sparingly to avoid attracting attention from any zombies that might discover the tunnel entrances. Ashley had organized their limited possessions into portable packs that could be dragged through the tunnels without creating excessive noise. Every item had been evaluated for its survival value versus its weight and bulk, a process that had forced them to abandon sentimental objects and focus solely on practical necessities. She'd also established communication protocols for their underground journey, using hand signals and whispered code words that would allow coordination without alerting potential pursuers. As the first pre-programmed distraction activated on the far side of town, the group watched through their barricaded windows as zombies began moving away from their building toward the source of the mechanical noise. The creatures moved with purpose rather than the random shambling that popular culture had led people to expect, forming loose groups that swept through the streets with frightening efficiency. Their coordinated response confirmed what the survivors had feared: these zombies possessed intelligence that made them far more dangerous than mindless monsters. Jake waited until the second distraction drew away another wave of zombies before giving the signal to begin their descent into the basement. Each member of the group carried specific responsibilities that had been rehearsed during their planning sessions, from Emma's role as medical support to Tyler's position as their advanced scout. The success of their escape depended on flawless execution, as any deviation from their carefully planned timeline could result in them being trapped underground with no avenue for retreat. The basement's atmosphere was thick with the musty smell of decades-old water damage and the metallic scent of rusted equipment. Marcus led them to the concealed tunnel entrance, dismantling his improvised barrier with practiced efficiency while keeping noise to an absolute minimum. The opening revealed a darkness so complete that their flashlight beams seemed to be absorbed rather than illuminated, creating an almost tangible sense of the unknown dangers that lay ahead. As they prepared to enter the tunnel system that represented their only hope of escape, the sound of splintering wood echoed from the store's main floor above them. The zombies had discovered their hideout sooner than anticipated, forcing them to abandon their careful timeline and plunge into the underground passages before all the distractions had completed their cycles. Their desperate gamble for freedom had become a race against time, with death lurking both behind and ahead of them in the suffocating darkness. The tunnel entrance swallowed them into a world of absolute darkness where every sound echoed with amplified intensity, transforming their careful whispers into what felt like shouts that could betray their location to any creature that might be listening. Jake led the procession through the narrow passage, his flashlight beam revealing walls that wept with decades of accumulated moisture and debris that threatened to snag their clothing or equipment with every forward movement. The air was thick with the smell of decay and stagnant water, forcing them to breathe through their mouths to avoid gagging on the putrid atmosphere that seemed to coat their throats with each inhalation. Emma followed directly behind Jake, her medical bag creating additional bulk that made navigation through the confined space even more challenging, but she refused to abandon supplies that could mean the difference between life and death for any member of their group. The tunnel floor was slick with an unidentifiable substance that made each step treacherous, and she could feel the cold moisture seeping through her boots as they splashed through puddles of unknown depth. Her training had taught her to remain calm under pressure, but the claustrophobic environment tested her composure in ways that emergency rooms never had. Marcus struggled more than the others with the confined space, his broad shoulders scraping against the tunnel walls as he maneuvered through sections that had clearly been designed for utility access rather than human passage. His construction experience told him that the tunnel system was structurally sound despite its apparent deterioration, but he could also sense the immense weight of earth and concrete pressing down from above, creating a psychological pressure that competed with their immediate survival concerns. Each supporting beam they passed had been evaluated by his experienced eye, looking for signs of potential collapse that could trap them underground permanently. The sound of zombies moving through the store above them filtered down through the building's foundation, creating a constant reminder that their former refuge was being systematically searched by creatures that had proven themselves capable of learning and adapting to human tactics. Tyler, positioned in the middle of their column, fought against the instinct to move faster through the tunnels, knowing that hasty movement could result in injuries or noise that would compromise their entire escape attempt. His youthful energy felt constrained by the deliberate pace that safety required, but he'd learned to channel his impatience into heightened alertness. Becca's ranger training had included wilderness survival scenarios, but nothing had prepared her for navigation through man-made passages where natural landmarks and directional cues were completely absent. She found herself relying on Marcus's knowledge of the tunnel layout, information he'd gathered during brief reconnaissance missions that had revealed multiple branching passages and potential dead ends. The complete absence of natural light created a disorienting environment where distance and time became difficult to measure accurately. Madison had memorized their planned route through the tunnel system, but the reality of underground navigation proved far more complex than her theoretical calculations had anticipated. Her flashlight revealed junction points where multiple passages converged, forcing them to make navigation decisions based on incomplete information and time pressure that prevented thorough exploration of alternative routes. The logical frameworks that had served her well in software development felt inadequate when applied to the chaotic variables of their current situation. Ryan brought up the rear of their group, constantly listening for sounds of pursuit while monitoring their equipment for any signs of failure that could leave them stranded in darkness. His mechanical knowledge had allowed him to modify their flashlights for extended battery life, but he knew that even their improved power supplies would eventually fail if their underground journey extended beyond their planned timeline. The weight of their survival resting on equipment reliability created a pressure that reminded him of critical system failures he'd encountered in his automotive work. Ashley found herself fighting against panic as the tunnel walls seemed to press closer with each step forward, her teacher's training in crowd control and crisis management feeling inadequate when applied to their desperate flight through underground passages. She'd never considered herself claustrophobic, but the combination of darkness, confined space, and mortal danger created an overwhelming sensation that threatened to cloud her judgment when clear thinking was most essential. Her role in maintaining group morale felt more challenging when she couldn't even see the faces of the people she was trying to support. The tunnel system revealed evidence of previous occupants, including makeshift shelters and supply caches that suggested other survivors had used these passages before them, though the age and condition of the abandoned materials made it impossible to determine when these temporary refuges had been established. Jake made mental notes of potential resources they could retrieve on their return journey, assuming they survived long enough to require additional supplies. The discovery of other survivors' presence offered both hope and concern, as it proved the tunnels were viable escape routes while raising questions about what had happened to their previous occupants. Water levels in the tunnels fluctuated unpredictably, forcing them to crawl through sections where the ceiling dropped to within inches of the flowing liquid that had accumulated over years of drainage from the town's deteriorating infrastructure. Emma's medical training made her acutely aware of the infection risks associated with exposure to contaminated water, but their situation left no choice except to continue forward through whatever obstacles the underground passages presented. The sound of their movement through standing water seemed impossibly loud in the confined space, creating echoes that could potentially alert any zombies that might discover the tunnel entrances. Their first major navigation challenge came when Marcus's remembered route led them to a collapsed section where decades of settling had caused the tunnel ceiling to buckle, creating a barrier that would require them to find an alternative path through passages that none of them had previously explored. The detour would add unknown time to their journey while consuming precious battery power from their flashlights, forcing them to make critical decisions about resource allocation while under the constant pressure of potential discovery by their relentless pursuers. The collapsed section forced them into a cramped side passage that Marcus remembered as a secondary drainage route, though his exploration of this particular tunnel had been limited to a brief reconnaissance that revealed only its initial accessibility rather than its complete path through Millbrook's underground infrastructure. The alternative route required them to crawl single file through spaces that seemed designed for water flow rather than human passage, with walls that curved inward to create a tube-like environment where their shoulders touched both sides simultaneously. Jake's flashlight revealed rust stains and mineral deposits that indicated decades of water flow, but the current passage appeared dry except for the persistent dampness that permeated everything in the underground system. Emma's medical bag became a significant liability in the restricted space, catching on every irregularity in the tunnel walls and requiring constant repositioning that slowed their progress while creating noise that seemed to echo endlessly through the interconnected passages. Her concern about the contaminated environment grew with each moment of exposure, as her medical training made her acutely aware of the various pathogens that could thrive in the stagnant conditions they were navigating. The confined space also prevented her from properly assessing the group's physical condition, leaving her to rely on whispered communications and occasional hand signals to monitor their health status as they pushed through increasingly challenging terrain. Marcus realized that his mental map of the tunnel system was becoming unreliable as they ventured into sections he'd never fully explored, forcing him to make navigation decisions based on structural logic rather than actual knowledge of their destination. His construction experience suggested that drainage tunnels would eventually connect to main sewer lines that might provide larger passages and clearer directional guidance, but the time required to reach these connections remained unknown. The weight of leadership responsibility felt heavier in the darkness, where wrong decisions could trap the entire group in a maze of underground passages with no possibility of retreat. Tyler's youthful flexibility made him better suited to the cramped conditions than the adults, but his position in the middle of their column prevented him from taking the lead role that his physical advantages would have allowed. His frustration with their slow pace was tempered by the understanding that any separation of the group could prove fatal, as individual survival in the tunnel system would be virtually impossible without collective resources and mutual support. The darkness played tricks on his perception, making distances seem both longer and shorter than reality while creating an environment where time became an abstract concept divorced from their usual understanding of duration. Becca's wilderness survival training had taught her to remain calm in unfamiliar environments, but the complete absence of natural reference points created a disorientation that challenged her usual navigation methods. Her ranger experience had involved situations where getting lost meant exposure to natural dangers, but their current predicament involved the additional threat of zombies that could potentially access the tunnel system through multiple entry points throughout the town. The sound of water dripping from invisible sources created a constant auditory backdrop that made it difficult to distinguish between harmless environmental noise and potential indicators of approaching danger. Madison's analytical mind struggled with the variables that couldn't be quantified or predicted, particularly the unknown extent of the tunnel system and the possibility that their chosen route might lead to dead ends or impassable obstacles. Her software engineering background had trained her to think in terms of logical pathways and predictable outcomes, but their underground journey involved too many unknown factors for systematic analysis. The failure of her usual problem-solving methods created an anxiety that competed with the immediate physical challenges of navigating through increasingly difficult terrain. Ryan's mechanical knowledge proved valuable when they encountered a section where decades of settling had created a gap between tunnel sections that required careful maneuvering to cross safely. His understanding of structural integrity allowed him to assess the stability of makeshift bridges created from debris that previous travelers had used to span the opening, though the age and condition of these improvised solutions made their reliability questionable. The decision to trust their weight to unknown engineering created another layer of risk in an already dangerous journey. Ashley found herself struggling with the psychological impact of their underground environment more than the physical challenges, as her teaching experience had always involved well-lit spaces where she could maintain visual contact with the people under her care. The inability to see facial expressions or body language that would normally provide cues about group morale made her feel disconnected from her usual role as emotional support for the team. Her efforts to maintain positive communication were hampered by the need for whispered conversations that couldn't convey the reassurance that normal speech patterns would have provided. Their progress through the alternative route was interrupted when Jake's flashlight revealed what appeared to be a recent collapse that completely blocked their forward passage, forcing them to consider whether to attempt clearing the debris or finding yet another alternative path through sections of tunnel that none of them had explored. The discovery raised troubling questions about the stability of the entire underground system and the possibility that their escape route might be systematically compromised by structural failures that could trap them between impassable obstacles and pursuing zombies. The sound of flowing water grew stronger as they approached what Marcus hoped would be a connection to the main sewer system, but their flashlight beams revealed that the water level in the larger passage was significantly higher than anticipated. The drainage tunnel they'd been following opened into a partially flooded chamber where decades of accumulated debris had created dam-like obstructions that redirected water flow in unpredictable patterns. Navigation through this flooded section would require them to wade through contaminated water of unknown depth while carrying their essential supplies above the waterline. Emma's medical concerns about waterborne infections intensified as they prepared to enter the flooded chamber, but their situation offered no alternatives that didn't involve even greater risks. Her knowledge of tropical diseases and infection vectors made her acutely aware of the potential consequences of exposure to contaminated water, particularly for any group member who might have unnoticed cuts or abrasions that could provide entry points for dangerous pathogens. The decision to proceed through the flooded section represented a calculated risk where immediate survival took precedence over long-term health considerations. The chamber's acoustics amplified every sound they made, creating echoes that seemed to carry far beyond their immediate location and potentially alert any zombies that might be investigating the tunnel system from other access points throughout the town. Their desperate flight through Millbrook's underground infrastructure had become a test of endurance that challenged not only their physical capabilities but also their ability to maintain group cohesion under conditions that pushed each individual beyond their normal comfort zones and survival experience. The flooded chamber stretched before them like an underground lake, its dark waters reflecting their flashlight beams in shimmering patterns that created the illusion of movement even when the surface remained perfectly still. Jake tested the water depth with a piece of debris before committing the group to enter, discovering that the flooding varied from ankle-deep near the walls to what appeared to be waist-deep in the center, where decades of sediment had created an uneven floor that couldn't be navigated safely without constant attention to footing. The water temperature was shockingly cold, immediately penetrating their boots and clothing while carrying a chemical smell that suggested contamination from sources far more dangerous than simple groundwater seepage. Emma made the difficult decision to transfer her most critical medical supplies to waterproof containers that Ryan had improvised from materials scavenged during their time in the hardware store, though the makeshift protection couldn't guarantee that their limited pharmaceutical resources would survive prolonged exposure to the contaminated environment. Her knowledge of water treatment and purification made her realize that they would need to find clean water sources soon, as dehydration would become a critical concern if their underground journey extended beyond their original timeline. The risk of consuming contaminated water had to be balanced against the certainty of death from thirst, creating another impossible choice in their struggle for survival. Marcus led their passage through the flooded chamber with careful attention to the structural elements that were visible above the waterline, noting that the chamber appeared to be a natural cave system that had been modified with concrete reinforcements during Millbrook's earlier development period. His construction experience allowed him to identify load-bearing elements that could provide handholds for stability while crossing the deeper sections, though the age and condition of the concrete made him question whether these supports would bear their weight under stress. The chamber's size suggested that it served as a collection point for multiple drainage systems, which meant that additional tunnel openings should be accessible from their current position. Tyler's youthful energy was tempered by the realization that a single misstep in the flooded chamber could result in submersion in water that might contain deadly pathogens, chemicals, or debris that could cause serious injury. His role as scout became more challenging in the aquatic environment where stealth required careful attention to water displacement and the sounds created by movement through liquid that amplified every splash and ripple. The darkness made it impossible to see underwater obstacles that could cause falls or entanglement, forcing him to move with a caution that contradicted his usual boldness in dangerous situations. Becca's ranger training had included water safety and wilderness river crossings, but the underground environment presented hazards that natural waterways rarely contained, including submerged debris, chemical contamination, and structural elements that could create entrapment risks. Her knowledge of wildlife behavior proved valuable when her flashlight revealed evidence of rat populations that had adapted to the underground environment, suggesting that the tunnel system provided connections to food sources and escape routes that might be useful for human navigation. The presence of living animals also indicated that the air quality in the tunnel system was sufficient to support life, though the long-term health effects of prolonged exposure remained unknown. Madison attempted to mentally map their route through the chamber while calculating the time required to reach their planned exit point, but the underwater terrain and altered landmarks made navigation far more complex than her theoretical planning had anticipated. Her systematic approach to problem-solving was challenged by environmental factors that couldn't be quantified or predicted, forcing her to adapt her analytical methods to accommodate variables that defied logical categorization. The software engineering principle of defensive programming translated to their current situation as a need to plan for multiple contingencies while maintaining flexibility to respond to unexpected obstacles. Ryan's mechanical expertise became crucial when they discovered that one of their flashlights had developed water damage that threatened to leave them with insufficient illumination for their continued journey through the underground system. His ability to perform field repairs using improvised materials prevented a critical equipment failure that could have forced them to choose between dangerous rationing of their remaining light sources or attempting to navigate through complete darkness. The repair process required him to work partially submerged while maintaining protection for the electronic components, creating a technical challenge that tested his problem-solving abilities under extreme conditions. Ashley struggled to maintain group morale while wading through water that seemed to drain their body heat with every step forward, creating a cumulative fatigue that affected both physical performance and mental resilience. Her teaching experience had involved managing groups under stress, but the combination of physical discomfort, mortal danger, and environmental challenges created a situation that pushed beyond her usual methods of motivation and support. The necessity of whispered communication limited her ability to provide the kind of verbal encouragement that had proven effective in previous crisis situations. Their progress through the flooded chamber was interrupted when Jake's flashlight revealed what appeared to be recent human activity, including makeshift markers that suggested other survivors had used this route within the past few weeks or months. The discovery raised both hope and concern, as evidence of successful passage through the tunnel system proved its viability while raising questions about what had happened to the previous travelers and whether they might encounter other groups competing for the same resources and escape routes. The markers appeared to indicate a navigation system that could guide them toward viable exit points, but following another group's path also meant accepting the risks that had influenced their predecessors' decisions. Emma noticed that one of their group members was beginning to show signs of hypothermia from prolonged exposure to the cold water, forcing her to weigh the medical necessity of stopping for treatment against the security risks of remaining stationary in a location where they could be easily trapped if zombies discovered their route. Her medical training emphasized the importance of maintaining core body temperature in survival situations, but their environment offered no opportunities for warming or drying that wouldn't create additional dangers. The decision to continue forward while monitoring for deteriorating condition represented another calculated risk in their series of desperate choices. The chamber's far end revealed multiple tunnel openings that corresponded to Marcus's understanding of the drainage system layout, but the water level had risen high enough to partially or completely submerge several of the lower passages that might have provided easier navigation routes. Their choice of continuing passage would determine not only their immediate survival but also their ability to reach the exit points that represented their only hope of escaping Millbrook's growing zombie population before their strength and resources were completely exhausted. The choice of tunnel routes from the flooded chamber created a critical decision point where Marcus's limited knowledge of the drainage system conflicted with evidence left by previous survivors, forcing Jake to make a leadership decision based on incomplete information while under the pressure of time constraints and the constant threat of zombie discovery. The markers left by earlier travelers pointed toward a passage that appeared partially flooded but showed signs of recent use, while Marcus's structural assessment suggested that a higher, drier tunnel would provide safer navigation despite having no evidence of successful passage by other groups. The decision was complicated by Tyler's discovery of fresh scratches on the concrete walls near one of the tunnel entrances, marks that could have been made by previous survivors but might also indicate recent zombie activity in the underground system. Emma's medical assessment of their group revealed that prolonged exposure to the contaminated water and cold environment was beginning to affect their physical performance in ways that could compromise their ability to complete their escape successfully. Her thermometer showed that two group members were approaching hypothermic conditions that would require immediate warming measures, but their environment offered no safe opportunities for rest or treatment that wouldn't expose them to greater dangers. The medical supplies she'd managed to protect during their passage through the flooded chamber included emergency heat packs that could provide temporary relief, but using them would consume resources they might need for more critical situations later in their journey. Marcus chose to lead them into the partially flooded tunnel that showed evidence of previous use, reasoning that other survivors' successful passage provided better guidance than his theoretical knowledge of a system that had been modified repeatedly over decades of municipal changes. The selected passage required them to wade through knee-deep water while navigating around debris that had accumulated at every bend and junction, creating obstacles that slowed their progress while generating noise that seemed to echo endlessly through the interconnected tunnel network. His construction experience allowed him to identify sections where the tunnel walls showed stress fractures that could indicate potential collapse, forcing them to move quickly through areas where structural integrity appeared compromised. Tyler volunteered to scout ahead through a particularly narrow section where the tunnel ceiling dropped low enough to require crawling through water that approached chest depth for someone of his smaller stature. His reconnaissance revealed that the passage opened into a larger chamber beyond the constriction, but the journey through the flooded bottleneck would require each group member to hold their breath while pulling themselves through an underwater section using embedded pipe fixtures as handholds. The discovery created another risk assessment scenario where the certainty of slow progress through known dangers had to be weighed against the unknown hazards of alternative routes. Becca's wilderness survival training proved valuable when she identified the source of a metallic smell that had been growing stronger as they progressed through the tunnel system, recognizing the odor as an indicator of chemical contamination that could pose serious health risks with continued exposure. Her knowledge of environmental hazards suggested that they were approaching an area where industrial runoff or waste storage had contaminated the groundwater, creating toxic conditions that could cause immediate illness or long-term health problems. The discovery forced them to choose between accepting the risks of chemical exposure or attempting to find alternative routes that might lead them back toward areas where zombies could intercept their escape. Madison's analytical approach to their situation led her to recognize patterns in the tunnel system that suggested they were following a route designed for emergency evacuation, with markers and directional indicators that had been placed by municipal authorities for use during flood conditions or other disasters. Her observation provided confidence that their chosen path would eventually lead to a viable exit point, but it also raised concerns about whether the emergency routes might be known to local zombie populations that had learned to anticipate human behavior patterns. The possibility that their escape route was predictable to their pursuers added another layer of complexity to navigation decisions that already involved multiple life-threatening variables. Ryan's mechanical skills became essential when they encountered a section where decades of pipe corrosion had created leaks that threatened to flood their tunnel passage beyond navigable levels. His ability to perform emergency repairs using materials scavenged from the tunnel infrastructure prevented a critical blockage that could have forced them to retreat through areas they'd already traversed while losing precious time and energy. The repair work required him to operate partially submerged while working with corroded metal that could cause serious cuts, creating medical risks that Emma had to address with their limited antiseptic supplies. Ashley noticed that the psychological stress of their underground journey was beginning to affect group cohesion in ways that could compromise their survival if individual members began making decisions based on panic rather than collective planning. Her teaching experience had shown her that people under extreme stress often reverted to self-preservation instincts that could conflict with group survival needs, requiring active management to maintain cooperation and mutual support. The darkness and isolation of their environment intensified normal stress responses while preventing the kind of visual communication that helped maintain social bonds under pressure. Their progress through the tunnel system was interrupted when Jake's flashlight revealed evidence of recent zombie activity, including claw marks on tunnel walls and organic debris that suggested the creatures had been investigating the underground passages within the past few days. The discovery confirmed their worst fears about zombie intelligence and adaptability, as it proved that the creatures were capable of systematic exploration that could eventually lead them to discover and block human escape routes. The evidence also suggested that zombies might be using the tunnel system for their own movement through the town, creating the possibility of underground encounters in confined spaces where escape options would be severely limited. Emma realized that their medical supplies were becoming critically depleted due to the various injuries and exposure-related problems that their journey had created, forcing her to make difficult decisions about resource allocation while planning for potential emergencies that could occur before they reached safety. The contaminated environment had already caused several minor infections that required antibiotic treatment, and the cold, wet conditions were creating respiratory problems that could develop into serious illnesses without proper care and warming. The discovery of fresh zombie activity in the tunnels transformed their desperate escape into a deadly game of hide-and-seek where the hunters possessed enhanced senses and intimate knowledge of their prey's limitations. Jake made the difficult decision to extinguish all but one flashlight, forcing them to navigate through near-total darkness while relying on whispered directions and physical contact to maintain group cohesion. The single remaining light source would be used only when absolutely necessary, creating a survival scenario where their greatest asset for navigation also represented their most dangerous liability for detection. The psychological impact of voluntary blindness in an environment already filled with unknown dangers tested each group member's resolve in ways that their previous hardships had only hinted at. Emma's medical training told her that several group members were approaching the limits of their physical endurance, with symptoms ranging from early hypothermia to respiratory distress caused by prolonged exposure to contaminated air and water. Her decision to administer their remaining stimulant medications represented a calculated gamble that short-term performance enhancement would allow them to reach safety before the inevitable crash that would follow when the drugs wore off. The medical ethics of her situation conflicted with standard treatment protocols, but survival conditions demanded decisions that prioritized immediate needs over long-term health considerations that might never become relevant if they failed to escape. Marcus felt the weight of leadership responsibility intensify as their situation deteriorated beyond his experience or training, forcing him to make navigation decisions based on instinct rather than knowledge while fighting against the growing certainty that he was leading his companions toward death rather than salvation. His construction experience provided some guidance for assessing structural stability and identifying potential exit routes, but the underground environment presented hazards that his professional background had never prepared him to handle. The sound of distant movement in the tunnel system behind them suggested that zombies had discovered their route and were following their trail with the patient persistence that had made these creatures such effective hunters. Tyler's role as scout became increasingly dangerous as evidence of zombie presence intensified, forcing him to venture ahead of the group through passages where an encounter with even a single creature could result in his death and the exposure of their entire escape route. His youthful reflexes and small stature provided advantages in the confined tunnel environment, but these benefits were offset by his inexperience with the kind of life-or-death decision-making that their situation demanded. The responsibility of protecting his companions through successful reconnaissance created pressure that challenged his confidence while forcing him to grow up in ways that normal adolescence never required. Becca's ranger training had included tracking and evasion techniques that proved valuable for detecting signs of zombie movement while minimizing their own trail through the underground passages, but her wilderness experience had never involved predators that possessed human-level intelligence combined with supernatural sensory capabilities. Her knowledge of animal behavior suggested that the zombies were conducting a systematic search pattern that would eventually locate their position regardless of stealth measures, creating a race against time where only speed and luck could prevent their discovery. The scent markers that normally allowed her to track wildlife in natural environments were overwhelmed by the chemical odors and contamination that permeated the tunnel system. Madison's analytical mind recognized that their survival now depended on variables that couldn't be calculated or predicted, forcing her to abandon the systematic problem-solving approaches that had served her throughout her career in favor of intuitive decision-making that felt foreign and unreliable. Her attempts to map their route and estimate travel times had become meaningless as obstacles and dangers forced constant detours through uncharted sections of the tunnel network. The software engineering principle of graceful degradation applied to their situation as a need to maintain essential functions while accepting the failure of non-critical systems and backup plans. Ryan's mechanical expertise became crucial when they encountered a section where municipal repairs had installed electronic locks on emergency barriers, creating obstacles that could only be bypassed through technical intervention that required tools and knowledge that normal citizens wouldn't possess. His ability to hotwire the locking mechanisms using improvised materials allowed them to access sections of the tunnel system that might otherwise have remained impassable, but the electrical work created sparks and noise that could attract unwanted attention. The irony of using municipal safety systems to facilitate their escape while potentially alerting the dangers they were fleeing created another layer of risk in their increasingly desperate situation. Ashley struggled to maintain her role as emotional support for the group while dealing with her own growing panic about their deteriorating situation and the mounting evidence that their escape attempt might end in death rather than salvation. Her teaching experience had shown her that group morale could collapse rapidly under extreme stress, leading to individual actions that compromised collective survival, but her usual methods of motivation and encouragement felt inadequate when applied to life-or-death circumstances. The necessity of whispered communication prevented the kind of verbal leadership that had proven effective in classroom crisis situations, forcing her to rely on physical presence and touch to provide reassurance that words couldn't safely convey. The tunnel system's acoustics amplified every sound they made while also carrying the distant noises that indicated zombie movement through parallel passages, creating an audio environment where the hunters and hunted were conducting their deadly game within hearing distance of each other. Jake's military training had included urban warfare scenarios, but nothing had prepared him for combat in confined spaces against enemies that couldn't be killed through conventional means and possessed sensory advantages that made stealth nearly impossible. The realization that their escape route might become their tomb forced him to consider desperate alternatives that could save some group members even if others didn't survive. Their flashlight revealed an intersection where multiple tunnels converged around what appeared to be a maintenance access shaft that extended upward toward street level, offering their first opportunity for surface escape since entering the underground system hours earlier. The discovery represented either salvation or a trap, as the vertical shaft could provide access to safety or become a dead end where zombies could corner them without possibility of retreat or effective defense. The maintenance shaft stretched upward into darkness that seemed to offer either salvation or death, with rusted ladder rungs that disappeared beyond their flashlight's range into what Jake hoped was access to the surface streets of Millbrook. The shaft's concrete walls showed decades of deterioration, with mineral stains and water damage that raised questions about structural integrity, but their desperate situation left no alternatives except to trust their lives to municipal infrastructure that had been abandoned when the town's population declined. Marcus tested the lowest ladder rungs with his full weight before declaring them safe enough for climbing, though his construction experience told him that the corrosion pattern suggested potential failure points higher up where visual inspection wasn't possible. Emma made rapid decisions about which medical supplies to carry during their vertical escape, abandoning everything except the most essential items that could treat immediate trauma or life-threatening conditions. Her assessment of the group's physical condition revealed that several members were operating on reserves that wouldn't sustain them through a prolonged climb, but the sounds of zombie movement in the tunnels below eliminated any possibility of rest or recovery before attempting their ascent. The stimulant medications she'd administered were beginning to show effects that improved alertness and energy levels, but she knew that the chemical boost would be followed by a crash that could prove dangerous if they hadn't reached safety by then. Tyler volunteered to climb first, his lighter weight and youthful agility making him the logical choice for testing the ladder's stability while scouting for obstacles or dangers that might await them at the surface level. His ascent through the shaft revealed that several ladder rungs were missing or severely damaged, requiring careful navigation and alternative handholds that would challenge the adults who lacked his flexibility and strength-to-weight ratio. The shaft's acoustics amplified every sound he made during the climb, creating echoes that seemed to announce their escape attempt to any zombies that might be listening from either the tunnels below or the streets above. Marcus followed Tyler up the shaft, his construction knowledge allowing him to identify the most stable attachment points for the ladder system while testing each rung before committing his full weight to potentially compromised structural elements. His progress was slower than Tyler's due to his size and the need for extreme caution with components that showed signs of metal fatigue, but his experience with building inspection provided confidence that the main structural supports would bear their collective weight if they climbed individually rather than attempting group ascent. The physical demands of vertical climbing after hours of underground navigation pushed his endurance beyond normal limits while the pressure of leading others to safety intensified every decision. Becca's wilderness training had included technical climbing and rope work, skills that proved valuable when she identified alternative techniques for ascending sections where the ladder system had failed completely. Her knowledge of knot tying and improvised anchoring allowed her to create safety lines using materials scavenged from their equipment, providing backup support that could prevent fatal falls if the deteriorated infrastructure failed under stress. The confined space of the shaft limited her movement options while requiring climbing techniques that differed significantly from the natural rock faces and tree climbing that her ranger experience had emphasized. Madison approached the climb with systematic analysis of the mechanical forces involved, calculating load distributions and stress points that could guide their ascent strategy while minimizing risks of catastrophic failure. Her software engineering background had taught her to think in terms of redundant systems and failure modes, principles that translated to climbing strategy as the need for multiple contact points and backup plans if primary support systems failed. The mathematical approach to risk assessment provided psychological comfort even when the physical challenges exceeded her athletic capabilities and comfort zone. Ryan's mechanical expertise proved crucial when they encountered a section where decades of corrosion had caused the ladder mounting brackets to separate from the shaft wall, creating a gap that required improvised bridging using tools and materials from their equipment. His ability to perform emergency repairs while suspended in a vertical shaft tested his problem-solving abilities under conditions that combined height exposure with time pressure and the constant threat of zombie discovery. The repair work created noise that echoed through the shaft system, potentially alerting creatures both above and below to their location and escape attempt. Ashley found that her fear of heights, which had never been severe in normal circumstances, became intensified by the combination of darkness, physical exhaustion, and mortal danger that surrounded their vertical escape attempt. Her teaching experience had included outdoor education activities that involved some climbing, but nothing had prepared her for ascending through a deteriorated industrial shaft while carrying essential supplies and listening for sounds that could indicate approaching death. The psychological challenge of maintaining focus on climbing technique while suppressing panic about their overall situation required mental discipline that drew on reserve she hadn't known she possessed. Jake's military training had included urban operations that involved building infiltration and vertical movement, but the civilian infrastructure and zombie threat created variables that his tactical experience hadn't addressed. His role as group leader required him to balance the need for speed against safety considerations while making real-time decisions about whether to continue upward or retreat back into the tunnel system if they encountered insurmountable obstacles. The responsibility for his companions' lives intensified every choice while the sounds of zombie activity below reminded him that retreat might no longer be possible regardless of what they found at the surface. Their ascent was interrupted when Tyler's reconnaissance revealed that the shaft's surface access was blocked by a heavy manhole cover that would require collective effort to move, creating a bottleneck where the entire group would be vulnerable if zombies discovered their location during the opening process. The discovery that their escape route wasn't immediately accessible forced them to develop a new strategy for surface breakthrough while maintaining security in a vertical space that offered no concealment or defensive positions. Emma realized that their medical supplies included emergency flares that could provide distraction for zombies while they emerged, but using the pyrotechnics would also announce their location to every creature within miles of Millbrook. Jake made the final decision to risk everything on a coordinated emergence that would either lead them to freedom or result in their destruction in full view of the dawn sky that was beginning to lighten above their underground prison.